Welcome to Overseers of Freedom today. We are so excited to be starting season 2 of our podcast. Today we have Amy, Amanda, and Kim. I'm Kim, and we are going to be discussing A Thomas Jefferson Education, Raising Leaders for the 21st Century by Oliver DeMille. This is one of our favorite books and what got us started doing a podcast and Overseers of Freedom in the first place. So we are super excited to be discussing that with you today. We should be live on Facebook, and you can watch us. Yeah, we'll hopefully have it up on YouTube and have it posted on Instagram as well. So,
yes, we are live on Facebook. So welcome. And if you missed a little bit of that introduction, today we're discussing A Thomas Jefferson Education. This is our first episode in season 2. And we're talking about education and specifically understanding how to think and the role that understanding how to think plays in leadership and in freedom. And it really becomes, when you understand the power of understanding how to think, you recognize that that is the critical skill needed to perpetuate freedom. And if we could only talk about one subject in order to perpetuate freedom, it would be the idea of learning and teaching yourself and your students, your children, those that you have stewardship over, how to think so that you can become a leader who loves freedom and who is willing to stand for freedom and have the courage to stand for what's right and to share your voice. Yes, would you guys agree?
Yes,
for
sure.
Absolutely. The whole reason we've all read this book originally. So I read this book originally in 2010, when Amy sent me a copy when I was looking for some options for educating our children. What about you guys? When did you guys read this book the first time? Because I know we've all read it multiple times.
I believe it was 2007, Amy? Beginning of 2007.
Yep, 2007.
Yeah.
And one of the things he talks about in this book is classics, books that you return to, or works of art, things that you return to again and again, and every time you get something new out of it. And we were talking about it before the podcast, but this time when we read through, because we're seeing things through a different filter. The first time I read this, I was really at a place of needing an education option for my children. We had just moved to a state where the school systems were not what we were wanting for our children. I had a child with disabilities. And I was looking for an education option for our children and bringing our kids home. And I've read it since then as my kids move through the education process. And it always hits me different. And this time, it really came at me through so much more of the filter of freedom and how important education is in preserving the freedom of our country and the things that have taken place in the history of our education over the last 70 to 100 years that have completely altered the future of the freedom of our country. And it started with the education system and how much our education plays a role in how we can either choose how we are going to save our freedom in this country or how we are and why we're going to lose it.
The story of how I found this book is kind of an interesting, and I think it plays into if you are thinking about homeschooling or you homeschool or as a parent. I had done a year of homeschooling with my kids, and it had been a disaster. I'd hated it. They hated it. We hated each other. We were just like, you know what? This was no fun. That was a fun experience, but never again. We're going to go back to what we know. And I went to a curriculum fair, and I had heard from my older sister, Tammy, I had heard her refer to this book, A Thomas Jefferson Education, that she had read years before that really talked about how to teach, how to help your children get a great education. And I saw it on the table, and it had just been, a new version had just been completed and published. And so I took home 2 books that day. And one was A Thomas Jefferson Education. And I opened it up and I read it in one sitting. And it's interesting because I read it again last night in one sitting. You can read this book. If you're just looking for like the overview of it, you can read it in about an hour and a half. It is not difficult to read. It's about 130 pages, and it's fascinating if you are looking for an alternative of how to educate your kids. Now, that's a myth, actually, in how to educate, that we can, that's actually one of the first things that he says is teachers teach and students educate. So it's our role to teach them and to inspire them, and then they go after and educate themselves. So I read this book and it flooded me with an emotion, and I knew, and the beautiful piece that very first time reading it, what struck me was that my children deserved something different. They deserve something better, that the public school system is a conveyor belt that historically was for the people who couldn't afford a better education, that was all that they had. They needed the government to provide an education because they had no other options. And so it's the lowest common denominator of all education choices. And yet in our country, it has become like 95% of people get a public school education. And so when I read this and I started thinking about my children, and I knew that they had greatness within them. I knew that there was that they were made for more. And this book spoke to me about how to help them get there. So it's not a curriculum. It's not going to tell you, well, he does give you some suggestions of some books to read, but it's not a series of, okay, year 1, do this, year 2, do this, year 3, do this. The second book I brought home from that curriculum fair was a book that did that. So this one is principles. And that can be really frustrating the first time you read it, is to just see principles, because you're like, we have been taught to want an instruction manual, and everything we get from education is an instruction manual. And all over Instagram today, you can download, there's the gurus who are like, okay, we're going to tell you exactly what to say to your kids on Monday and on Tuesday, on Wednesday. And this is not that. But what's fascinating, I think we should all just take a minute and talk about what our kids, so 2007 is how many years ago? A lot, right?
15 years ago. Yeah, because it was when Katie was a baby. She's 15.
Okay, so 15 years ago. So we've all been through it. Our kids are raised. Amanda and I have grandbabies. It's like we're in another phase. So we've been able to see what this has done. And I have raised leaders. We have raised leaders and really incredible humans through this process. And so even though it feels so different compared to what like everybody else is doing, it works.
So everybody should take a minute and say what? Yeah. What did you want us to say?
Well, I was going to say, just talk a little bit about how this impacted your family, like reading this and kind of initially, because now we're reading it from the freedom point and maybe from the old lady club. Like, okay, we've done this and now there's like another phase. But when we first read this 15 years ago and how it kind of influenced what we did.
So Amy read her book and then passed it to me like the next day. And I also read it in one sitting. But before I started homeschooling, I basically spent a year reading all the books about homeschooling and what I wanted to do. And then I actually started homeschooling, and I bought one of those curriculums that this is what you tell your kids on Monday. This is what you tell your kids on Tuesday. And after 2 years of that, I wanted to pull my hair out, and it was just so stressful because I was doing school at home. And I didn't know where to turn, and I didn't know what to do about it because I had seen bits and pieces of what I wanted in these other books, but I didn't know how to do it because nobody was doing really, or I didn't have a community of people that were doing it. And so Amy gave me this book, and it was like all the things that I had been wanting to do in one book, and the reason and the purpose. And so we talked about this on our Instagram Live, but this is, other than the scriptures, the book that's changed my life the most, because the goals and the focus for my children and for my family has completely changed since reading this book. And one of the main things is the goals for education. So the goals for education when you're in public school, or to train you what to think so that you can have a good job someday. And the focus on the Thomas Jefferson Education is training leaders so they can lead out in society. And so our focus is on character development and becoming the great person and fulfilling your mission. There's a huge difference in the way you educate somebody that's going to go out into the world to fulfill a mission versus get a job. And so I read this the first few times with my children in mind. And then as I read it again, I realized, well, this is something I have to do. It's not just for my children, it's for me. And it's a way of life for my whole family. And then my focus even changed more, that I have to have the education that I want my children to have. I have to be the leader. I have to be reading the books. I have to be focusing on my character and the kind of person that I want to be. I have a mission to fulfill. I have to do these things if I want my children to do them. And so I think that's how it's really impacted our family, is that it's given us a whole different focus of why we do the things we do, why we say what we do, why we raise our kids the way we do, and why we live the way we live and do the things that we do. I mean, it takes time to, go out into your community and lead book clubs and to do podcasts and things like that. And there is a reason behind it now, So.
So for my family, we found TJ Ed quite a few years after Kimberly and Amy. We had our children in public school, and we moved to California with no intention of changing the fact that our kids were in public school. My sisters were all homeschoolers. I was the weird one out. I come from a large family. Everyone homeschooled except for me. And that wasn't going to change until I walked into a local public school in Northern California and proceeded to walk out and call my husband and say, there has to be another alternative. There was just some things that were covered in our orientation that for my children just were not going to be a good fit. I had to have a child with a daughter with learning disabilities. And it just wasn't going to be the right place for us. So I called Amy and said, okay, what do I do? What are my options? At the time, I was thinking like charter school or private school or something. And she sent me a copy of a Thomas Jefferson Education and told me, before you make any decisions, read this book. And so I did. And like her, I read it super quick in one night. And it completely changed everything. And for me, one of the main things that changed was realizing that after so my daughter at the time was almost 12, and she had been in the public school disability system with an IEP since she was 2 years old. So for 10 years, we had spent meeting after meeting, test after test, telling her what was wrong with her, telling her how she needed to change in order to be like everybody else, setting these goals on how we were going to get her to be closer to what everyone else was doing. And I read this book, and what spoke to me, and the Lord spoke to me and said, Trina is exactly who I made her to be. She does not need to be any different. You do not have to change her. And that changed everything for me as a parent, and especially a parent of a child with disabilities. And then I had my husband read it. Actually, he didn't read this. He listened to Oliver DeMille, one of his talks where he goes over this. And he felt the same way and had the same inspiration. And we brought this into our home, and we went to our children and said, your education's up to you. We will provide the environment, and we will do everything we can. And when we sat down with Trina and we said, you can do whatever you want. We're no longer going to tell you who you're supposed to be or what you need to do by the end of the year or set these academic goals for you. You get to set them for yourself. And at the time, Katrina was reading significantly below what would be considered grade level, to where she couldn't hardly read at all. And within about 6 months of taking all the pressure off and saying, this is totally up to you. What do you want to do? And then because I was studying this, and like Kim was saying, the focus then became about me and the example I was setting for my children. And this really spoke to me because that's how my father raised us. Amy and I were raised by a dad who spent his entire life continuing his education. He was always reading. He was always going to seminars. The amount of, back in the day when you bought the seminars on cassette tape or even record player, my dad had all of those. He was always continuing his education. He was always teaching us something new. He was a very hands-on in our education parent. And so when I read that, I realized that I had given my children's education to the state, and I wanted to take it back and do for my children what my dad had done for us. And it completely changed everything. I had the daughter with disabilities, and we were dealing with that, but I had a son in 3rd grade at the time. And when I said we're going to do school from home and start educating at home, he became first super excited because it meant he wasn't going to have to do anything, is what he thought. And second, as we began to try and do this stuff, he started to really push back. And I realized one of the things he had was a total hate of learning. He was at that age that young boys so often in public school decide that learning is no longer fun. And we had to deprogram that and turn learning into fun, into a passion. And now he's an adult, and it is amazing to watch him learn and study and excel in the areas that he's super passionate about. From the kid who, if you said school, he would like throw a tantrum and go lock himself in his room because he was not going to do school. And it's just amazing how much difference it makes when you can set that example and let them learn that education is their own responsibility.
It's so cool hearing the stories of how you can apply. And this is the beautiful thing about reading a book that is principles, because when you read a book that is principle based as opposed to having actual instructions. So let's compare this to a nutrition plan. If you have a nutrition plan and it says, okay, tonight you're going to cook salmon and Brussels sprouts, and here's your thing that you do. Well, what if you're allergic to salmon? Like, what do? But if they say, okay, pick a meat and a this and a that, now you can apply what works best for your family. And the same thing happens with education, is that your children are unique, and they have strengths, and they have talents, and they have things that make them who they are. And these, because of how different they are, if you really think about it, how absurd, like literally how ridiculous is it that we have common standards across the entire country for every child who is this age and born between this date and this day. We're going to put them into a box and say, every child has to learn this, and you don't get to progress until you've done these things. And if you get too far ahead, we're going to pull you back. If you get too far behind, we're going to speed you up. But you have to have all of this, and you don't get to finish until you can check all of these boxes. Like in what world is that the education that provides for the greatest good of the individual child? Now, that's the easiest way to train a whole lot of people. Like, if you've got an agenda and you've got 1 million children you have to teach, the easiest way is to say everybody is going to learn this. But here's what I know. My children deserved better than that, because I knew how unique and how individual, and that they were born with genius. And what's interesting is that that's something that I think that I felt, but I didn't. It wasn't until reading this that I really was like, oh, yes, okay, I believe that. Reading this book gave me the words that I needed to describe the education I wanted for my children. I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to be custom. You can only raise leaders by having an individualized learning plan for that child based on their strengths and what they need. And I have 3 sons and a daughter. Our daughter is still going through this. She's 13. And maybe I'll just start with Betsy. Betsy has autism, and her education looks so different. It was interesting. It was good for me last night to go through this again, because I realized she's just coming into, at 13, love of learning. Like she has, right now, she's like, I want to learn Spanish. I want to learn Japanese. I'm ready to learn how to play the guitar. Like, she's just coming into a love of learning, when her brothers at this age were moving more into like a scholar phase. And actually, that's not even true. They all came in at different ages. They all had a different experience. But they all learned different things. One of them was much more science-based and really loved science and engineering. And then there were kids, one of my sons just loved reading and spent all his time reading. And so they got to take time to really focus on what their strengths are and what they love to do. And here's what I know is that when you allow a child to really focus on what they are good at and what they love, you unlock something within them that they just are like, oh, I want to do more of this. I enjoy this. I can do this. And if you do that long enough, they choose to learn the hard things because they understand how learning works. They understand that they can learn. It's not a scary, icky, yucky thing. It's like, oh, I know how to learn and I want to learn how to do that. And so I'm going to go learn that.
I think for me, can I say something really quick? I remember reading this the first time, and I have a good friend that read it at the same time as me, and we both launched our TJ Ed career, I guess, like launched into it with our children. They were the same age at the same time. And I remember the fear that came with reading this. The idea that if I take my children off this conveyor belt where they say that if they do these things, they will end up in this place. But I read this book and it says, but there's a better way. And if you take them off and you trust yourself, they're going to end up somewhere even better. And thinking, really? My 7-year-old son who has no interest in really learning anything is eventually going to say to me, I just want to read, or I just want to learn, or like lock himself in his room and ignore the family so he could learn more things. I was super skeptical. And you might feel that when you read this the first time and have that same, I don't know, because we are so programmed through the conveyor belt education and through our society that there is only one way to do this. And what the three of us can all attest to is they absolutely will do it themselves. And when they do it themselves, they will do it better. It's so amazing now to be able to, I guess the word is testify to the truth of these principles that are in this book. That they do turn out okay. And not only do they turn out okay, they turn out amazing. I know for all three of us, we get asked on a regular basis, what did we do? Why are our adult children different? Why are they the way they are? Why are they leaders? Where did their work ethic come from? Their desire to learn, their leadership skills, where did all of that come from? And it came from this. It came from reading this, trusting this, and then building a community. My community that I built started with Amy and Kimberly, and then I went out into my community. I started talking about what I was doing, and so many other moms in my community were like, tell me more. And we got together. I didn't know what I was talking about. I just kept quoting Oliver DeMille. And we built a community of 5 or 6 families, and we raised our children together this way. And it was absolutely amazing. And it does work. And it will be okay. And it will turn out actually better than you could ever imagine.
I agree with Amanda that it does turn out better than you could ever imagine. And I think that, I lost my train of thought, but I thought maybe we should go over, first I'll talk about my kids for a minute, but then we can go over the phases of learning. But, so I have a daughter who's right now getting her master's in Boston, and she was like the perfect TJ Ed person of like, so she went through the phases just like you should. And her scholar phase, we'll talk about in a minute, just was like reading all the time, like nonstop. And then I had my son come along, and his scholar phase looked completely different than my daughter's. All he wanted to do all day was play the piano. And at first I was like, why isn't he reading? Why isn't he reading? Why isn't he reading? And then I realized his mission had to do with music, and he was developing what his education was. He was developing his education for what his mission in life was. And then I had my third son who just wanted to do science all day. And so if they were in public school, my oldest daughter, she would have been fine. She would have been fine reading her books all day. But my son, who was involved in drama and music and everything, he would not have gotten the education that he needed for his mission in the public school setting. So everybody's mission looks different, and the way they're going to get it looks different. And we have to allow our kids the freedom to say, this is what I want. And it can be super scary because coming from the conveyor belt, and I'm like, okay, you do this and this and this, and then you go to college and you get your degree and you make however much money, and to say, okay, I'm going to let you practice the piano for 6 hours a day. Like, that can be scary. But if you know the principles, and you say, they have a mission to fulfill, and God's instilling in them this desire for certain things that they need to learn. So my son, for whatever reason, needed to practice the piano for 6 hours a day. And I think that we have to trust that God is giving them the desires to learn and grow and do certain things that are going to prepare them. Just like if I follow my passions and the things that I like, they are going to help me fulfill my mission. And so kids are not able to do that when they're spending 8 hours a day in public school learning what somebody else wants them to learn, who says it's important for them. Now, there's certain things that kids need to be able to do, like read, but also that doesn't need to be forced either. It just, well, let's go over the phases. My thoughts are all over the place right now.
Isn't it interesting? No, I love that. I really love that you brought that up. And you used a word that I think is really important in this process, and that's the word trust. There is a trust that has to happen. And the public school, this conveyor belt and our current school system, there is no trust. You cannot trust a child if you do not compel your child to learn, and if you don't force, and if you don't mandate, and if you don't do these things, children are lazy and they're going to just play video games, and they're not going to do anything unless you force them to learn, unless you force them to do these things. That's what we've been taught. And it's fascinating. If you actually study education, this idea of public school education is really new. Like, the world existed just fine. People learned, curiosity. If you look at a young child, Amanda and I have grandbabies, children are so curious. They are fascinated with life. What happens is that the school system beats the fascination out of them because it creates a hate of learning, because the process is not, I want to use the word enjoyable for those young kids. And so there is a trust that has to happen. And it's really scary when you have been conditioned to not trust. But it's the idea of trusting that your kids are incredible. When given the opportunity, you can trust them to, and part of the trust, this is interesting, Kim, as you were sharing this, one of my favorite quotes of all time is begin with the end in mind. And then you talk about the end a lot. The way you do this is it's not a secret. You talk about it. You share the end with your kids. You are going to, this is what you're doing. When we went through this, I would say to my kids, you've got a love of learning. You're gaining this love of learning. You're just going to want to study all the time. You're just going to fall in love with learning. You get to learn whatever you want. And you're going to, like, I was just painting the picture again and again and again. And that's such an important, I think, piece of it. And so, Amanda, I can tell you were going to share something.
Well, I think of it like you were talking about our grandbabies, right? I'm watching, he's 14, 15 months old, and I watch him and I think, I wish I had read this before my children were born, because I can see the innate desire to learn. It starts at birth. No one has to tell a baby how to crawl. Your babies just learn to crawl. Whether you want your 1-year-old to learn to walk or not, they will learn to walk. You put them in a situation where they get to explore and learn and grow, and they will just do it. Watching him learn to stack blocks up and sort things by, he's already starting to sort things by like size or things that look alike, and not because someone's sitting with him telling him how to do it. It just comes innate. And we, like Amy said, we beat that out of our children. We take that away from them when we start saying, if I took him and I sat him down and I said, you're going to sit here and we're going to stack blocks for the next 30 minutes, he would completely lose attention and he would never want to touch blocks again. He's going to go find something else to do. And when we take that, you have to do this right now. And I would even challenge what Kimberly said about everyone needs to learn to read. Everyone needs to learn whatever it is that they need to learn. I have a really good friend whose adult son, because of disabilities, cannot read. And yet he has a full-time job. He has a driver's license. He is very, very well educated. He can discuss War and Peace and The Tale of Two Cities, and he's brilliant, but he never was able to learn how to read, and that has not stopped his education. Education will happen as long as the environment allows education to happen, and education is something they have to do for themselves. Teaching can happen anywhere. Education is done inside, and you have to choose to become educated. That's why we can't educate someone in a public school system. If someone doesn't want to learn what the teacher is teaching, they will not learn what the teacher is teaching. Education is a personal desire to learn more.
Good. I'm glad you clarified that. I appreciate that. I was just going to say, I'll give a brief synopsis of the beginning phases, and then maybe we can talk about the learning environment and what's needed for the learning environment, because we've talked about that a couple times. But okay, so core phase is typically from 0 to 8 years old, plus or minus 99 years, right? So the DeMilles always put plus or minus 99 years on whenever they give it an age, because it's different for everyone. But the lessons in core phase are right, wrong, true, false, good, and bad. And that's where the character development comes in, and really we focus on that. That's the primary thing we're trying to teach our children in core phase, is to have the core values.
And there's one you missed there, Kimberly, really quick. My favorite of the core phase is work and play.
There you
right,
go.
Wrong, good,
yes,
bad.
We learn the lessons through work and play. Yes, through work and play in the family. But the work is like family work. It's not through scholastic work. It's not through forcing them to do school. Then next we have love of learning, which is typically age 8 to around 14 plus or minus 99 years. And love of learning is where they really get into see that learning can be fun. They're just figuring out their interests. They're going from topic to topic to topic, reading this and that and this. They're not going deep on anything. It's surface, but they're seeing what's out there. They need to get an idea of what there is out there so they know what their passions are. They know what they like. They know what they want to do. And then about the time they hit puberty is when scholar phase can start. And that's when they've found their interests and they want to go deeper. They realize that they have a mission. They want to get the education that they need for their mission. And so now that they've sampled everything in Love of Learning, they know what their interests are and they can go deeper on that. And then next is depth phase. And typically that's in college. Typically that's where you get a higher education. And that's when you're going really deep. That's why it's called depth. You're going really deep in your interest. So those are the big phases that are covered here in the book that are for younger kids.
And then like the cool thing is how these phases came about. So you might be like, all right, where is this even coming from? So it's called a Thomas Jefferson Education because Oliver DeMille, when he went through and he started studying the history of education and some of the greatest leaders of history, and he was looking for common pieces. How were they educated? What did their education look like? And what Kim just described is how historically leaders are educated. They have the time where they're learning their core phase and they're learning the important work ethic and connection to God and connection to family. And then they move into the ability to study and learn a lot of things. And then they have a more focused scholar-like education. And and it goes on because then after depth phase, you move into mission phase. And that's where I think mission phase is so important to know that that's coming because that's the purpose of your education. The purpose of your education is that you have a mission. You have something that you were called to do, and understanding that the purpose of education is to fulfill your mission. And so you move into mission phase, and then from mission phase, you move into impact. Once you've fulfilled your mission, then you move into impact and so mission phase is that adult phase and then impact is kind of that grandparent stage where you move into and you get to take everything that you've learned through your life. And rather than like so often we're taught that the good life at the end of a life well lived is to get in your RV and go travel around the world and just like focus on yourself. The leadership model is that when you get to that stage in life, that's when you get to give back. That's when you get to have impact on and use what you've learned to help others. And that's kind of a beginning with the end in mind, is recognizing that this is about leadership. This isn't about getting a good job and like just focusing on yourself and only doing for you. This is about living a life that has an impact, where you have significance and where what you do matters in the world. And maybe not everybody feels that way.
Well, I
know they don't.
And I think, they don't. And it was just funny. You're like, when you're a grandparent, I remember reading this book and thinking impact was so far away. And as you talk about that, being the grandparent, you reach the phase where you're passing mission and you're going into impact, realizing that, ladies, hello, this is where we are, right? We are now those.
I'm feeling old today. I'm feeling old.
Yes, feeling so old. I remember thinking impact, that's so far away. But the reality is we are beyond, at the end of the mission phase, going into impact, where that's why we're feeling so passionate about speaking up, about this podcast, about sharing on social media our opinions about education and freedom, because this is how we have impact, and we take our experience of the last 15 years and a lifetime of raising children and a lifetime of entrepreneurship and have impact on our community and on our own little corner of the world. And that just really hit me, Amy, when you read that's where we're at, which is, feeling kind of old. But when you said that not everyone wants that, it makes me think of the leadership crisis that he talks about in the book on page 27. He says, what happens when a society does not prepare leaders? This is the beginning of the first full paragraph. We get managers and professionals leading in areas they have no training for, as a government such as government, and we get a nation of followers who see no problem with that because they have no experience with anything else. So we get a nation of followers who see no problem with the fact that our government has no leadership skills. And that is, this nation of followers is where we're at, like this idea that no one questions anything. And this is when we talked about having this podcast, and this one specifically, we really wanted to focus on how to think versus what to think and why that is so important. And I think that's what's here, because people who know how to think, when you learn how to think, you question, critical thinking, you have conversations, you have debate, you don't get crazy emotional when someone disagrees with you. It's not about opinion, it's about facts. And it's having conversations to discover more facts so that you can get to the root of decisions, so you can make your own decisions and come to your own opinions versus taking someone else's opinion as fact. You have something to say, Amy. I can see that.
You have something to say that, and so this is on page 14 in the middle of the paragraph, and it's talking about how, like, what happened to the public school model, like why are we seeing what's going on? And he says, schools were historically created by parents to allow great teachers, mentors, and classics to inspire students to seek learning and I can read out loud, to seek learning and then guide students on their path to quality education. Okay, so it says that's where it started. That's what they wanted, was to help children to have quality education. But if you keep reading, it says, then schools were attacked by political agendas from both sides. Conservatives felt that the expense of education should be justified by training students for job market. Okay, and that's what you hear us talking about. Like, okay, so we go to school to teach so that you can get a job. But Amanda, will you read that next sentence where it says, and liberals?
Sure. And liberals saw schools as the perfect place to gain support for social agendas ranging from civil rights to environmentalism.
Social agenda. So then it becomes like, this is becoming like a, what's the word that you were using, Kimberly, yesterday?
Activism versus leadership.
Yes. And so the first time I read this, and kind of actually what I've held on to, and probably because I lend to a more conservative view, is, okay, well, the public school is to teach so that you can get a job, right? I hit this, like, I read that yesterday and I was like, holy freak, what it has become. And because now the majority of teachers are lean to the liberal, like, we attract, like, liberals outnumber like 30-1 in the education environment. And they are focusing on this idea of it's the perfect place to gain support for social agendas. And that is what we're seeing today. And so that is, and if we skip forward to page 23.
Amy, really quick, can I focus on one thing in that paragraph while we're here?
Yeah.
That I thought of? So we're going to talk about where education has gone and what is currently happening. But I want to go back really quick to the very first line in that paragraph. Schools were historically created by parents to allow great teachers to inspire students to seek learning and then guide students on their path to a quality education. That was the original purpose of schools, was for parents to help children find mentors who would help them become the leaders and get their own quality education, not just any education. And that was interesting to me because I talked earlier about our father who had a total leadership education. And I wondered why my dad, because my dad was very different than my friends' fathers in the way he saw things, but that schools are historically created by parents. Our father grew up on a homestead in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, where his dad built the local one-room schoolhouse and taught him and the neighbors and other parents in the community would come and they would teach their expertise and they would help the children become educated. And that by remembering that it is our responsibility to create the environment where our children can receive a great education, it is not the political agenda. Our children should not be part of a political agenda under any circumstances, and certainly not 8 hours every freaking day of their entire childhood.
And that's where, exactly. Now go to page 29 in the second paragraph when it says, spending all day in an institution run by adults, each equally requiring and supposedly deserving the respect and unfailing obedience, can provide competition in a child's mind and heart for loyalty to and trust in his parents and the future's own culture and the family's own culture and values. So what it's saying right there is there is a competition between what is being taught in school and what is being taught at home. And that is what has happened today, is that now there is several generations who have chosen to listen to the education process. Like, okay, there's experts and we have to trust the experts and they know what's right better than my parents, better than the people in my community, better than all of these people. The experts know. And so like Amanda, you're saying initially it was this, and now, no, parents don't even get a say in what's being taught.
And if you go to a school board meeting, you're put on the FBI watch list or something. If you come to the school board meeting and talk about what you want for your kids.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a quote on page.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Kim.
There's a quote on page 40 that says, education makes a people easy to lead, but difficult to drive, easy to govern, but impossible to enslave. And that's what we've lost, is like true education. We are doing job training now. So the people are going to be easy to drive and easy to enslave because we don't have true education. We're not teaching how to think anymore. And that's one of the huge things in this book, is learning how to think.
And on that next page right there, conveyor belt education system, so that's what we're referring to when we're talking about public schools, has made us, this is the very bottom of the page, has made us more highly trained as a generation, but less educated. And educated means you know how to make decisions. You know how to come to a conclusion. You know how to have a conversation, a debate, to have critical thinking, to decide that something is important to you and go out and learn what you need to know to make that happen. That's education. Being trained is knowing what to think. 2 + 2 is 4. That is training. And we have taken training totally and completely, or training has completely taken over our school as the focus, with a good portion of that training having to do with the political socialization bent on it, that your training makes you think a certain way, and very often different from what your family's is. We got asked so many times, and I don't know if this is still a question, I hope it's not, but so many times, what about socialization? And
it's still a question, because I still get it.
And I was like, are you kidding me? What do I want my children to be socialized to do? Not that. I want my children who can walk into any situation with any age, young or old, and contribute to the conversation. That's what I wanted for my children. Not the idea that I'm in third grade, so I hang out with third graders and I look up to sixth graders who beat up on people and second graders are beneath me. I didn't want them taking that into their life, the idea that you have to only stick with one type of people. I wanted my children to learn they could fit into any situation, any religion, any ethnicity, any political conversation, that they could join the conversation and have something legitimate to say, that, and then to learn from that and make decisions one way or the other about what they believe. And so that idea of socialization, if that is something that is keeping you from pulling the trigger on bringing your children home and taking back control of your family's morals, values, and ethics, do not let socialization be one of the things, because what they're socializing your children for in public school is not what the adults you want in your children to become.
Right. And I'll just go on to say that when you're homeschooling, your kids are still interacting with people all the time. You're not sitting home all day, every day, never leaving the house. Your kids are, on average, homeschooler kids are involved in more activities and groups than public school kids because they have more time. But also I wanted to say too, like, true education is not just giving them the skills to have a job. Education is about educating the whole person, and the character development is a huge, huge part of that, which is not found in the public schools, which they've actually purposely removed from public schools. But that's why, to have a leadership education, you need to be educated through, like, you need to be taught the character principles that will help you be a leader. You're not going to be a leader if you don't have those character skills. You can, I guess, be a leader, but it's not going to be the same as if you have those character traits and character skills that are so important to develop. And I shared on our Instagram a PragerU video by Dennis Prager, was talking about right now in society, the way that the right and left view change is different. The right is viewing it as it's the individual person's right to better themselves, and by bettering themselves, they can better their family, better their community. They will have influence, and it's like in the 7 Habits, it talks about your circle of influence. Your circle of influence is going to grow as you better yourself. Where the left's view on changing society is, it is our job to force people to change to what we want. And that's brought about through activism and all these social agendas that they have. That's the reason that we have them, because they're trying to force their social change on us. And he's the example of Barack Obama saying, we're 6 days away from fundamentally changing America. We don't want America fundamentally changed. We believe that change comes slowly through individuals, one person at a time, not being forcing an agenda on somebody. And I think that's also the difference between, like, leadership and activism. Here we have activism on one side. We're going to go out and we're going to scream and yell at people to believe what we believe. And if you don't believe what we believe, we're going to burn your business down, and we're going to, slash your tires and break your car all up. Or versus leadership, where I have to gain the skills to be able to lead people. I have to gain the character skills, and I have to lead through example. And I better not be leading people in something that I can't do myself. And so there's a huge difference in the type of education you're going to get if you want activists. There's a difference between the kind of education you should be giving your children and yourself if you want activists versus leaders. Hopefully I said that okay.
Yeah. And that idea, here's the thing that's just fascinating, is that there is only one way, and that we have to compel everybody to do the right thing as chosen by whoever is in power. So this is the basis. This is what is happening right now in the country, is that there's one way to think about pick a topic. There's one way to think about it. And if you think differently, then you are attacked, you are canceled, and so there's one way to think, and it has become so intimidated to speak out and to say something different. And it's interesting to me, because in a country that was based on like the whole idea of freedom and being able to choose and to make your own choices and live in a way like, so those who left England in the 1600s and came to America so that they could believe and choose the religion that they want to choose, right? That's the whole point. They like came over and said, you believe your way, and if you're gonna live in Virginia if you think this, you're gonna live here if you think this, and everybody, you go find the people that you want to be with, but you get to choose. That started the whole thing. And now we've gotten to the point where it's like, nope, you cannot think that, you cannot talk about that. And now we can't even have a discussion. And at the very end of this book, and we probably need to be kind of closing this up, but the chapter 10 talks about statesmanship, making a difference in society. And he explains what is a statesman, and I encourage you to go read it. But he talks about 4 crucial things that a statesman, somebody who's going to make an influence, needs. They need to understand. They need virtue. They need to learn wisdom, diplomacy, and courage. Those are these 4 things: virtue, wisdom, diplomacy, and courage. Think about if you began with the end in mind with your child and you said, okay, what does my child need? Like really ask yourself, what does my child need to become the best version of themselves? Would that list include, okay, they need to know physics, and they need to know chemistry, and they need to know, like, would you write out a list of academics that they would need? Or could I challenge you to think they need to understand virtue? They need to have a right and wrong. They need to have that peace in them and be so convicted that they can speak about it, that they have wisdom, that they have the diplomacy where they can speak, where they don't have to go attack and burn and destroy, but that they can have diplomacy, and that they have the courage to stand up for what they want. That is what we need today. We need a reform where we allow our children to maybe step away from this ridiculous idea that you've got to spend 8 hours a day for 17 years and learn the academics that somebody is telling you to learn, and maybe allow them to step into who they were meant to be and what they need to learn, and trust them, give them the time to be able to say, yeah, I have a purpose. I have a mission. I have strengths, and it matters, and it can be different than my neighbor and my cousin and my brother, because I was made to make a difference. I am here at this time, in this place, and I have everything that I need to get there. And I want to say to you as parents, you are the expert in your home. God gave you those children because you are exactly who they need. And you're listening to this. If you made it to this place and you are listening to this, there is a reason. And I want you to trust yourself. Just as we're talking about children and our youth learning to trust themselves, as the parent, you have a mission, and your children are a huge part of that. And I want to encourage you to do that. Does anybody have anything they want to share?
I was just going to say one thing on that. I love everything you just said, absolutely. And I want to extend everything you just said about your students and your children. All of that applies to you as the parent. You have a mission. You have an education. You need an education. You need to set that example for your children, and that is the very first step. If you're wondering how you do this, you do it by doing it first, and then your children do it alongside of you, and you set that example. You start by getting this book, and you read this, and then you talk about it with your spouse and your children. and you have those aha moments, and you share them with them, and you ask them for their opinion, and you start there. You start by leading out by example, and that is how your children will get a great education. And I know that sounds super overwhelming and scary that you have to do it first, but you do have to do it first. And as you dig into that idea of you, not them, and really focus on your education, they will suddenly focus on theirs. It just comes along right alongside you. It's your infant learned to walk because you were walking. They learn to sit in a chair and eat off a plate with a fork because you sat in a chair and ate off a plate with a fork. They will learn to educate themselves. They will learn to become great thinkers. They will learn to have amazing conversations and debates and stand for freedom and stand for themselves and stand against tyranny and socialism and all the horrible things coming down the pike for our country because you set that example first.
I think that's awesome. I agree with both what you both said. And I just want to say that we're not raising children, we're raising adults. And if we want our children to do something when they're grown up, they need to see us set the example. So I really like what you said. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We will be back in 2 weeks with our next discussion.
Anyone know what that is?
What we're talking about next?
Someone have the list handy?
I have the list handy. Hold on. Dumbing Us Down.
Oh, good
John
one.
Taylor Gatto.
Oh,
good one.
that's going to be a good one, especially after this.
Yes.
All right. We'll see you then.